Welcome to Crash Course Injury Law with Joe Ghabour.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Crash Course Injury Law with Joe Ghabour, founder of Joseph M. Ghabour and Associates. Joe's a personal injury attorney licensed in New Jersey, New York, and Florida, who helps injured pedestrians and families understand their rights after serious roadway accidents. My name's Sean O'Connor, and today Joe and I are talking about pedestrian accidents in New Jersey. Joe's going to go over how liability is determined, what protections exist, and why these cases can be more complex than people expect. Joe, how are you? Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
I mean, obviously, you get pedestrians involved, things get a little more complex. I think that's a given. Can you explain, specifics about what makes pedestrian accidents different from a typical motor vehicle collision?
Absolutely. The biggest difference is vulnerability. In
Hmm.
a normal car accident, people usually have the benefit of the protection of the vehicle, seat belts, airbags, the actual frame of the car. A pedestrian doesn't have any of that. So even a relatively low speed impact can cause catastrophic injuries like traumatic brain injuries, spinal injuries, fractures, and sometimes it'll lead it to permanent disability. So
Hmm.
that's the major things. Another major difference is how these cases are really investigated. In pedestrian accidents, there is often a heavy focus on visibility, whether the person who is the pedestrian was visible, especially if it's a nighttime accident. It also focuses on right of way issues, traffic signals, lighting conditions, and whether the driver had enough time to avoid the collision. So these cases very quickly become fact-based. So it's very important to make sure that all the facts are lined up correctly.
So how do the investigators and insurance companies go about determining, who had the right of way, or I mean, when a pedestrian's hit, of course, we're talking about here.
Well, they generally start by looking at the location of the impact and
Hmm.
whether the pedestrian was in a marked crosswalk, crossing with a signal, or, bolting out in the middle of the roadway. Police reports, surveillance footage, traffic camera footage, witness statements, even the location of the damage on the vehicle are all very important and necessary to help reconstruct the accident. So, under New Jersey law, drivers generally have a duty to yield to pedestrians in crosswalks and
Hmm.
at many intersections. But investigators also look at whether the pedestrian obeyed the traffic signals and exercised reasonable caution. And I always come back to this, if someone is running out in the middle of the street between parked cars, it's not really going to be very favorable to the pedestrian if the pedestrian is struck because the driver did not have an opportunity to basically stop the car from striking the pedestrian. So insurance companies are immediately going to begin evaluating both sides' conduct because fault allocation can directly impact the value of the case.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I was always wondered about that whole, because it happens, right? A pedestrian darts out, maybe for good reason, but darts out, and the driver is basically caught off guard, and it's tragic, but also, is it reasonable to expect that the driver's completely at fault there? I think probably not all the time, huh?
Yeah, a lot of times the darting out in the middle of the car really applies to children. They're playing ball outside, especially if the weather gets nice and it's, summer day and they're chasing the ball and they dart out in between parked cars. There's not much that a driver can do to stop in time from, striking that child. So a lot of these pedestrian cases really involve children, which is very sad. But unfortunately, that's just the way the life goes when it comes to children playing outside. A lot of times the drivers don't have an opportunity to stop.
What um what about behaviors that drivers might be involved in that lead to pedestrian injuries in New Jersey? Are there some common uh, factors there or trends that come up again and again?
Well, in New Jersey or in any other state, driver distraction is usually the biggest culprit of all these things. So drivers are on their phones, they're looking at their navigation system, They're watching Netflix as they're driving or what have you. I mean, things like that. Basically, anything that shows the driver was inattentive and was distracted. Another major factor is speeding. A lot of times, if you're going the speed limit, you may be able to stop in time from striking a pedestrian. But if you're speeding, the chances go way down that you'll be able to stop in time. So, those two are the major things, distracted driving and speeding. Those are the two things that usually cause a lot of pedestrian accidents.
Hmm.
The other thing that we often see is drivers failing to yield at crosswalks.
Ah,
They're making a left-hand turn and they don't realize that, the pedestrian is walking across the street, or, the bar of the frame of the car is in the way and they're
yeah,
unable
blind
to see
spot
the
there, kind of.
pedestrian. Blind spot, exactly. And sometimes they're just not paying attention and they're not checking for pedestrians. Or another thing that we often see is people that are driving drunk or impaired. That's a huge cause of pedestrian accidents because,
Hmm.
again, you're looking for the big vehicles, but you're not really paying attention to the individual crossing the street. So, in many cases, a lot of these accidents could have been averted if the driver had been attentive and wasn't speeding, or just was paying a little bit more attention than they do often with these pedestrian accidents.
Got it. Um, we'd mentioned uh, pedestrian fault, I guess. I mean, in terms of, uh, you mentioned the distracted driving and some of those things on the pedestrian side. I'm guessing there's a list of behaviors that end up jeopardizing them, right? Not using a crosswalk, for example, or
Yes, absolutely. So, just the same way that there's an obligation on the driver to pay attention as he or she is driving, there's also an obligation on the pedestrian to make sure that they follow the traffic rules. So, you cross with the walk sign, you cross at a crosswalk, you pay attention as you're crossing so that, you're not on your cell phone, for example, as you're walking and then get struck by a car. New Jersey has a comparative law, negligence law. So basically, it doesn't always have to necessarily be the driver's fault 100%. It could be maybe 70% on the driver, 30% on the pedestrian. And if that's the case under New Jersey's comparative negligence laws, the compensation that the pedestrian may be entitled to would be reduced by the percentage of negligence attributable to the pedestrian. So if the pedestrian wasn't paying attention or was, on the phone or was looking down and wasn't looking up and could have potentially avoided the accident, there's going to be some comparative negligence that is going to be attributable to the pedestrian as well.
interesting. So I think this is kind of adjacent or maybe just a logical next question here, which is this idea that, okay, so pedestrian has been injured and there's bills to pay, right? You've got medical bills and, I'm curious with that comparative fault equation you're just talking about, that must affect how bills get paid or what happens there, no?
No, actually, in no fault states like New Jersey, where there is a no fault system, fault doesn't really factor into who pays for the
Oh,
medical bills. So, in the case of a pedestrian, for example, if you have a car at home and you have an insured car, your automobile insurance would cover you as the pedestrian for your medical bills, subject, of course, to your deductible and your copay.
hmm.
So if a pedestrian is walking down the street and gets struck by a car and he has his own vehicle at home, then his automobile insurance coverage under the personal injury protection aspect of it would cover his medical bills. If that person does not have a vehicle at home, but lives with a relative who does have a vehicle that is insured, then the relative's insurance policy would actually pick up the medical bills as well. Now, if they do not have insurance, or sorry, they do not have a vehicle, if they have a vehicle that is uninsured, they don't qualify for any personal injury protection coverage at all because that's not permissible. However, if they don't have a vehicle that's registered, they don't live with a relative who has a vehicle that is registered, um, then they would have to go through a program that the state has. It's called a New Jersey KIGA, which basically covers the medical expenses up to $250,000 for those who do not have auto insurance and do not have a vehicle. and are injured as a result of, a pedestrian accident or, bicycle accident even, it would be covered under that.
Understood. I didn't know that. That's good. That's good to know. Um, what about evidence? What types of evidence matters most in these cases? Camera footage, obviously witness statements, accident scene details. Like you said, the investigators are out there trying to reassemble things. What what evidence matters?
Any evidence that can show negligence on the part of the driver matters. So surveillance footage, dash cam footage, traffic cameras, ring cameras in the
Hmm.
neighbor's front door that may have captured the accident. Any evidence whatsoever, eyewitness testimony or eyewitness, if you saw the accident and can come forward and testify or give a statement that he or she saw the accident and how it happened. So anything at all that can basically show who was at fault in the accident, um, that is very, very important. And insurance companies, they will send out investigators immediately to see if they can find that evidence, to see what their exposure is going to be. So it's very important that any evidence that you're aware of, you let your lawyer know immediately so that evidence can be preserved.
Yeah, I was going to say that timing timing matter. I mean, it's obviously if you're in a serious accident as a pedestrian, you're not winning that against a car in terms of your injuries, but it probably does behoove you to report and take action sooner than later in order to capture potential evidence or footage or whatever it might be, huh?
Yeah, a lot of times, slow impact accidents where the car is not going too fast, it'll cause a lot of harm, but it may not necessarily put a person, in oblivion or make them unconscious. So in those situations, it's good to document as much as you can. Of course, if the accident is serious, you're going to be taken by ambulance to the nearest emergency room or trauma center for treatment. You're not going to be able to obviously get any of that information, but that's why it's important to make sure you have an attorney who can actually have someone go out and investigate to see what's going on. And again, we pay attention to not only surveillance, not only witness statements. We look at skid marks, we look at vehicle damage, we look at debris patterns, lighting conditions, weather conditions. We look at the timing of traffic signals, whether they're working correctly or not. And we even if the case goes, through litigation where we have an opportunity to get discovery, we look at cell phone records to see whether the driver was on the phone, was using a lot of data at the time, which would imply that that person may have been, on YouTube or what have you. So we look at all that evidence. It's again very important. There is no evidence that really should be discarded unless it's not relevant at all. So it's very, very important to look at all the evidence because the smallest detail could make a huge difference in a pedestrian accident case.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, is there a case, I don't know, in the recent past where some detail that, to the average person might have seemed like no big deal, but ended up being kind of uh, a pivotal piece of info?
Well, without going into any specific case, we've handled cases where, for example, the police report showed that the pedestrian was at fault, darted out in the middle of a car, was crossing in between two parked cars, and was wearing, dark clothes at night. Um, and we were able to obtain surveillance footage to show that, in fact, that wasn't the case. So at that point in time, the police report became irrelevant
Mm.
because there was, better evidence that showed exactly how the accident happened. So, it's very, very important that you look at all the evidence. Don't discard anything because it's important to make sure that we have a clear picture of what happened. And just because the police report says that, X, Y, and Z happened doesn't necessarily mean that's what happened. More often than not, the police officer did not witness the accident. So he's going off of whatever evidence he can see, whatever statements he can get. A lot of times, if you're a pedestrian who just was struck by a car, you're not going to be in any state of mind to give a statement. So a lot of times, the police officers will just take a one sided statement from the driver who of course is in the position of trying to make himself or herself look like they weren't at fault. So there's not much credibility really. I don't put a lot of weight into, police reports unless the police officer, him or herself, saw the accident, witnessed the accident, or have independent third party witnesses who have given statements. to the effect of to what happened in the accident.
Got it. What about what would you tell families? Kind of expectations here, right? What should families know about the timeline in these cases? You've got you might have severe injuries, some long-term implications. What would you tell clients or potential clients about timeline?
Well, I always tell clients, especially when it comes to pedestrian cases, we have to look at the long term effects of an accident like this. So these cases do take time because a lot of times the pedestrian who is struck, whether that person ends up in the hospital or just goes for outpatient treatment, we don't really know the extent of the injuries that that person has suffered
Hmm.
until some time has passed by. Obviously, if we have to litigate the matter, the statute of limitations in New Jersey is 2 years from
Okay.
the date of the accident. So there's plenty of time before we are required by law to file the complaint in court. So during that time, that's when we, do our liability investigations. And that's when the pedestrian gets the treatment that he or she needs. Once that treatment is identified or once the prognosis is given and, we have an indication as to what the long-term effects are, then we are in a much better position to settle the matter. And if we're unable to settle the matter for what we believe is fair and equitable to the pedestrian, then at that point in time, we will go ahead and litigate the matter, and that will take, again, once the case gets filed, you're probably looking at another couple of years before the matter gets to trial before a jury. So it's a long-term process, but sometimes that's necessary in order for you to be able to get the proper compensation for the injured party.
Yeah, I would imagine, and if an insurance company can get things cleared up quick at a lower potential, award, then they're gonna be motivated to do that. How does that, the insurance side work? And we only have a couple of minutes left here, but what determines how the claim might move forward? I suppose like whether you're going to settle or go to court, or what's your experience?
A lot of times, the insurance company will make a lowball offer right
Mm,
in the beginning of the case to try to get the case resolved, or basically not resolved, but often their plate.
yeah,
And a lot of times, they'll do some really, unprofessional things where they will reach out to the person who was injured and say, "Hey, listen, we looked at the police report. Yeah, we don't think our guy is at fault or our driver is at fault, but you know what? We'll give you $500 just to help you with your medical bills." And they sound like the friendliest people on the phone.
right,
They are not your friends. I
right.
always tell clients you have absolutely no obligation to speak with the defendant's insurance company at all. And that's why it's important to get counsel early so that when they do call, and they will call, you let them know that you're represented by counsel, and then you give them your attorney's information. That way, they back off and they realize that this is not one of those cases that they're going to be able to railroad the person who was injured. So it's very, very important to be represented early on. And at the very least, even if you're not represented early on, do not give them a statement. Anything you say can and will be used against you when the matter goes to trial. For example, they will say, "I spoke with the pedestrian, 10 days after the accident, and he was at the park. He was fine. There's no long-term effects, etc." So there's no good thing that can come out of the pedestrian speaking with the defendant's insurance company.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. Um, and also, it's just a shocking experience, literally, right? Like the trauma around that, and even if you're not
Absolutely.
really, if you're not put in the hospital, it still shakes you up. And I think that, I don't know about you, but under pressure, I think, you don't make all the best decisions. It's sort of like, okay, start with the attorney, not to blatantly sell your services here, but just that, like, okay, don't worry about it. Call the attorney, and then that takes care of itself in that kind of a way.
Absolutely. You
Yeah.
lose nothing by consulting with an attorney, and you just protect your rights, whether it's with myself or any other personal injury attorney. The idea is to make sure that your rights are protected and that you don't get railroaded, and you get pennies on the dollar for an injury that may happen. And again, even in low impact accidents, especially if you're a pedestrian will always lose. It's just physics. And even if there's no broken bones or concussion or anything like that, there is still going to be some injuries due to the fact that you're getting struck by a couple of ton vehicle at the very least. So it's important to get checked out and always to speak with an attorney as well.
Good point. Joseph, thanks very much. We're up against time here, but as always, good to see you. And I look forward to talking again in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You bet. That's it for today's episode of Crash Course Injury Law with Joe Ghabour. To learn more about pedestrian accidents, liability, and the steps to take after a collision, visit Joe's website, ghabourlaw.com. You'll find clear, practical information to help you understand your options there. Thanks for listening. And don't forget, leave a review, share this episode with someone who you think might benefit from the information, or subscribe to the podcast. I'm Sean O'Connor. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.